Hi guys, now welcome to our analysis of the opening of Act 1. So, Blood Brothers, Act 1, the first part. And remember, in subsequent classes, we're going to be focusing on the foils, the contrasting characters, Mickey and Edward. And then we're also going to be focusing on the ending of the musical, the play itself. Okay, so the first thing we notice then when it comes to Act 1, the stage directions, the overture comes to a close. Overture is simply a piece of orchestral music, so not a song itself. So sometimes, of course, it would just be simply played over the tannoy system. Sometimes then, of course, you'd actually have a live orchestra in the pit in front of the stage. Okay, so usually the music itself will be quite melancholy as such, because remember, it's supposed to clearly indicate the mood or strike the keynote of the play. And remember, this is in essence a tragedy. So we have Mrs. Johnson coming on stage, and she just simply sings two lines. And you have to kind of think to yourself, okay, why is she singing at the beginning here? Why doesn't she simply say these particular lines? Tell me it's not true. Say it's just a story. So it's supposed to indicate, of course, that she is horrified, that she is distressed, that she is distraught at the very beginning. And then we understand, of course, when it comes to the reenactment, the silent reenactment of the tragic deaths of Mickey and Edward, that this is why she is devastated then. This is why she is so shocked by what has happened. So the narrator steps forward. So remember, the narrator, of course, two simple functions: to tell the story, obviously to narrate, but also to comment on the action, rather like a chorus. And he is speaking as well. So this is supposed to be kind of matter of fact, very informative. So he says, so do you hear the story of the Johnson twins? Notice, of course, that the language is spelt phonetically. The words are spelt phonetically. So this is kind of indicating then, of course, the Scouse accent, the Liverpudlian accent. Notice the contraction then, instead of Y-O-U, it's just Y apostrophe. So do you hear the story of the Johnson twins? So it's almost just like simply recounting the story. As like each other as two new pins. So we notice, of course, that it becomes like lyrics, essentially. Even though it's spoken, it's like a poem, a verse. So obviously they're twins. Of one womb born on the self-same day, how one was kept and one given away. And did you never hear how the Johnsons died, never knowing that they shared one name, to the day they died when a mother cried, my own dear sons lie slain. So indicating, of course, the plot itself, revealing the plot at the very beginning, much like the beginning of Romeo and Juliet, when we learn, as I said, that a pair of star-crossed lovers take their lives. So, stage directions, the lights come up to show a reenactment of the final moments of the play, the deaths of Mickey and Edward. The scene fades. And remember that you have to speculate as to why Willy Russell does that at the very, very beginning. Think about it. It creates tension. It creates intrigue for the audience. We now know that these two central characters will die at the very end of the play. Now we are left to figure out how they die, why they die. So think about it. We're hooked. We're there. We're kind of wondering, okay, these particular characters here, what's going to happen? So our minds are kind of racing ahead, and we're trying to piece together what could possibly happen then from what we learn at the very beginning of the play. So it's a clever way then of helping us to invest in these particular characters, and it's a clever way then of intriguing us as audience members. So Mrs. Johnson enters with her back to the audience. This is actually quite important then as well, because the narrator is our focus essentially here as he's speaking. So he says, and did you never hear of the mother so cruel? There's a stone in place of her heart. Then bring her on and come judge for yourselves how she came to play this part. Now, this is very significant here because the narrator is not just simply telling the story. The narrator provides a kind of social commentary here. The narrator is clearly indicating what society at that particular time thinks about Mrs. Johnson. So if we think about it here, the narrator then almost becomes like a spokesman or spokesperson. The narrator clearly indicates society's disapproval of Mrs. Johnson's actions. Okay, because think about it, he simply says there's a stone in place of her heart, saying that she is cruel and unfeeling, that she willingly gave away her child. Literally using the word cruel here, but then inviting us, then bring her on and come judge for yourselves. So immediately we feel sympathy for her because she is judged so harshly. So once more, it's a very clever device and trick used by Willy Russell here. And think about Mrs. Johnson, we're not focusing on her as such, we're focusing on what the narrator has to say, and then we're processing what the narrator is saying. And then she turns, the narrator exits, and now our focus is on her. Okay, so blocking essentially how the characters move and are presented on stage is very important. It's actually vital here as such. Okay, so remember we have to pick up all of the clues as to the setting. We should know, of course, when we're watching that it's set in Liverpool because of the accents. We should know, of course, the time period because we're now looking at costumes and hair and props and so on. So we deduce, of course, that it is the 1950s. We also think about the narrator here expressing society's point of view, a society that would condemn then a mother for giving her child away rather than trying to understand that. Okay, a society, of course, that condemns a mother who gives her child away rather than questioning why she needed to do that in the first place. So the narrator exits. Music is heard as Mrs. Johnson turns and walks towards us. Remember, of course, her name, Mrs. Johnson. Even if you think back to what the narrator has just said, there's a stone in place of her heart. The word stone there, is that supposed to be a pun on her name as such? Mrs. Johnstone. Stun. So she turns and walks towards us. She's aged 30 but looks more like 50. Now this particular idea is picked up on later on by Mrs. Johnson herself when she talks about the idea that she's been sort of ground down, beaten down by life and circumstances, by her background, by her class, by the way that she has been mistreated and abused by her husband who abandoned her, and by society who has effectively abandoned her as well. Okay, so we're garnering a little bit more sympathy then essentially for Mrs. Johnson as more is revealed and as she herself then begins to tell the story. So she sings, and think about it. Think about why she sings here as well. Singing, music, dancing, very important to her and very important then in terms of telling the story and relating to the audience. So she simply tells the story then. Once I had a husband, you know the sort of chap. I met him at a dance and how he came on with the chat. So it's the idea here, of course, how he's depicted, first of all, as kind of charming, essentially charismatic, flirtatious as well, very persuasive. So these are the simple elements then that we get from this. He said my eyes were deep blue pools, my skin as soft as snow. He told me I was sexier than Marilyn Monroe. So if we think about Marilyn Monroe, this particular image is a cultural reference or allusion. Okay, now it is repeated not only in Act 1 but also later on in the play. So basically an allusion or reference that is used again and again. So a repeated image or symbol or reference is known as a motif. So we have the motif or symbol or cultural reference of Marilyn Monroe. Now, do we know who Marilyn Monroe was? Hopefully we do. If not, I'll just give you a little bit of background information. So Marilyn Monroe, of course, was a famous actress, usually kind of associated with the 1950s, the early 1960s. She was also regarded as a pin-up girl, so very beautiful and very glamorous. She had short blonde hair. She had quite a voluptuous figure as well. So admired and lusted after in equal measure. Her most famous films, I suppose, would be Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, The 7-Year Itch. She had quite a coquettish voice as well, very flirtatious and very high. If you think about it, the most famous, I suppose, clip of her where she's singing Happy Birthday to JFK. She has almost a little girl voice, essentially. So she was presented then as a kind of blonde bombshell in those particular films. But unfortunately, of course, she wasn't really taken seriously by a lot of people because they thought that she was just a dumb blonde, that she was unintelligent, okay, that she had the beauty and she had the glamour, of course, of Hollywood, but that she wasn't really, of course, an intellectual by any stretch of the imagination. But of course, in reality, we know that she actually had an IQ of 160. So she starred in Some Like It Hot with Jack Lemmon and Tony Curtis. That would be perhaps, we'd say, her best film. And she showed, of course, that she was an excellent comedian and she was a perfectionist as well. I think very, very famously, they said that it took her 86 takes to say one line, which was, "Where's the bourbon?" That was basically that particular line. So she was known then, of course, for being a very particular kind of pernickety actress as such, and she took her job very, very seriously and her career very, very seriously, but unfortunately a lot of other people did not. So think about it. What does she represent? She represents glamour, she represents charisma, she represents beauty, of course. This particular ideal of womanhood back in the 1950s, because she had a curvy figure. But it's kind of the idea, of course, that nowadays, I suppose, in Hollywood, she'd be considered fat because she was a size 14 to 16. And essentially, of course, in Hollywood, thinness is prized. So it kind of emphasised the difference between our culture and then 1950s culture, of course, or American culture in the 1950s. Also, when we think about Marilyn Monroe, of course, there is a darker side. So it's not just the idea that she was sort of, in a way, patronised, or that her efforts in her acting were sort of trivialized. It's also the idea that she had a tragic demise. So basically, it's rumoured, of course, that she had numerous affairs, in particular with JFK, so that's John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the president, and indeed with his brother, RFK, Robert Fitzgerald Kennedy. And basically then, towards the end of her life, she overdosed and she died as a result. So there are numerous conspiracy theories about how it was the mafia or it had something to do with the Kennedy clan and so on. But it's really just kind of to emphasize the idea of this kind of inner torment, you know, that she looked beautiful on the outside and she appeared to have it all, but inside she was a very troubled woman. And if you know anything about, we'd say, her childhood and so on, she was a victim of abuse. So it really sort of emphasizes then how this particular image would have a positive connotation and also a negative connotation. Sort of the idea that men would lust after her. She's seen as the ideal woman, but she was also abused and patronized, and then she died a very sad and lonely death, essentially. So she died then, as I said, from suicide at the age of 36 in the early 1960s. Okay, so if you think about it, first of all, that helps us to establish setting, you know, kind of background, essentially, that particular time period. And then it's very important in terms of the symbolism as well, and how it relates back to how women were treated and how women were viewed and sort of prized essentially just for their looks. How Mrs. Johnson's husband was attracted to her, of course, because she reminded him of Marilyn Monroe. But then as soon as, of course, he got what he wanted, he was on to the next woman, the next victim as such there. Okay, so this is a very traditional song as such in that you do have a kind of verse, chorus aspect to it. So the chorus or the refrain very simply then is, and we went dancing, we went dancing. And dancing in this particular song really emphasizes that idea of youthfulness and the idea of a carefree couple and sort of dancing the night away, going out at the weekend, not having a care in the world, and kind of focusing on themselves very much and the sense of socializing and enjoying themselves. Then, of course, I found that I was 6 weeks overdue, so she found herself pregnant. We got married at the registry and then we had a do. So it was a registry office wedding, not a church wedding, which would be, I suppose, more typical back then. So it's kind of emphasizing the idea that it was a rushed wedding because she was pregnant, she had to get married. Once more, society's expectations, kind of cultural norms, of course, and societal norms at that particular time. Then women, of course, were supposed to get married and then have children, and it was associated with shame, of course, if they did not actually get married first before having a child. So having a child out of wedlock, of course, was considered scandalous back then. So they had a do, which would suggest, of course, a small celebration as such. It's a kind of colloquialism. We all had curly salmon sandwiches and how the ale did flow. And even think about it, curly salmon sandwiches. Yeah, I think at a wedding, curly, of course, would suggest that they were stale, that the ends were curled up, essentially. And then ale, you can think for a wedding, surely it should be champagne, shouldn't it? It's supposed to be a celebration, a happy occasion. So it really emphasizes their poverty then, how little money they actually had. And maybe it emphasized, of course, the fact that he didn't have an awful lot of money. And then we see, of course, she finds herself in this particular predicament of being pregnant and giving birth. And then what's going to happen? Who's going to make a living? Who's going to make ends meet as such? So having ale, kind of like a fruity beer, obviously, instead of champagne, really emphasizes their class, and it emphasizes their poverty as well. They said the bride was lovelier than Marilyn Monroe, kind of emphasizing how beautiful she was at that particular time. The next reference. So then we had the chorus refrain again, we went dancing. Then the baby came along. We called him Darren Wayne. Then 3 months on, I found that I was in the club again. In the club basically is a little idiom. It's usually an English idiom, and it means, of course, to be pregnant again. So it's not kind of like a euphemism. The club is actually very similar to a bun in the oven, because it literally means in the pudding club. So the idea that the baby is baking inside the womb. Okay, so the baby is growing like a cake or a bun would actually, of course, be rising in an oven. So that's where it comes from, that particular idiom then, the pudding club. So think about it. Okay, she gave birth and then 3 months later she was pregnant. It really emphasizes the circumstances of women back then, of course, that contraception was not really an option, that contraception was not widespread. And remember, of course, that abortion wasn't legalized in England until 1967 as well. So think about working class women, and also the idea, of course, that women in terms of sexuality, they would have to just simply have sex with their husbands even if they didn't want to. So marital rape, remember, was not a crime back then either. So it's really kind of emphasizing the idea that especially poor working class women would be forced to have large families. They didn't really have a choice here. And though I still fancied dancing, my husband wouldn't go. With a wife, he said, was twice the size of Marilyn Monroe. So this is the idea that she has kind of outlived her purpose, essentially, that he wanted her when she was young and beautiful. But now, of course, that she's a mother, and now that she has gained some baby weight, he's just simply disposing of her, just simply discarding her. So it's the idea perhaps then that he was cheating on her even before he left. No more dancing, no more dancing. By the time I was 25, I looked like 42. That relates back to the stage directions, remember, indicating, of course, that she looks 20 years older. With 7 hungry mouths to feed and 1 more nearly due. My husband, he walked out on me a month or 2 ago for a girl, they say, who looks a bit like Marilyn Monroe. So the idea that these women are kind of interchangeable, and the men, of course, can be feckless. The men can be, we'd say, as independent as they want to be. They can simply flit from woman to woman, and nothing, of course, is said or done. So it shows the total hypocrisy then of that particular society, that the women are condemned and the men get away scot-free. So that particular song then ends, and we're back to the stage directions. An irate milkman, irate of course means angry, the narrator, so the narrator doubles up, remember, rushes in to rudely interrupt the song. So he of course starts demanding then of course money for the milk, and that really sets it at a particular time period as well, because think about it, you don't really have the sort of milkman coming around every morning delivering milk bottles to your doorstep nowadays. So it's really kind of emphasizing, of course, a bygone era as such. So we can see how harsh he is, and that reminds us then of the narrator and society's disapproval here. He doesn't care that she has 7 mouths to feed. He doesn't care that she is pregnant. He doesn't care that milk is vital to her. He just wants and needs the money. So she insists, I said, I'll pay you next week. And he said, next week never arrives around here. I'd be a rich man if next week ever came. So it really kind of emphasized the very harsh, judgmental society here. And then Mrs. Johnson, remember, plot detail is important here. Look, I start a job next week. Think about the kind of domino effect here. She's starting a job. Who does she meet then? Mrs. Lyons. Then that leads, of course, to the decision that she's going to have to make. So he says simply, don't look at me, love. I might be a milkman, but it's got nothing to do with me. That's supposed to be kind of humorous. It's kind of the idea, of course, of the housewife having the affair with the milkman. And then the milkman is actually the father of her child rather than the husband. And the husband is unaware. I mean, think of, say, Pat Mustard and Father Ted. That's riffing on that particular image as well. So the milkman exits. Mrs. Johnson then stands alone, and we hear some kids off stage. And this is a clever way of actually introducing the children rather than actually bringing us into the house and then having 7 child actors on stage. Just kind of think about the logistics of that. So all you do is you hear them call out to her then, essentially from the side of the stage. And it's like a chorus of voices, and she becomes overwhelmed then, essentially. Becomes a little bit like sort of voices in her head, kind of plaguing and tormenting her and telling her, of course, you're not a good mother, you're not able to provide for those children. And it really emphasizes what a tragic figure she cuts on stage as well. She's just sort of standing there, and you just hear the voices, like a wall of voices of her children then. So the children then indicate, of course, that the baby is crying, he wants his bottle, where's the milk? And then even that question, how come I'm on free dinners? That'd be free school dinners, you see. And kids could be bullied for that at school as well, if they had the free school dinners, because everybody would know, of course, then that their parents couldn't afford dinners, or lunch, essentially it is. Mother, I'm starving, and so on then. I'm hungry, I'm starving, we get all that. And then she tries to reassure them. And we can see, of course, how protective she is here, how she wishes for more for her children. I know it's hard on you, all you kids, but try and get some sleep. Next week I'll be earning, we'll have loads of things to eat. We'll have ham and jam and spam. And then she slows down and just simply speaks the rest. Roast beef, Yorkshire pudding, Battenberg cake, that's that sort of square one with the marzipan, chicken and chips, corned beef, sausages, treacle tart, mince and spuds, milkshake for the baby. All of that food would once more reinforce that the setting is, of course, the time period is the 1950s. So there's a chorus of groaning from the kids, of course, when they imagine all this wonderful food. So she says then, of course, we'll live like kings when I bring home the money, like Marilyn Monroe, and we'll go dancing. So kind of emphasize the idea, of course, that she's hopeful, that she's idealistic, that there's still just a little glimmer of positivity there, that she wants more for herself. She wants more for her children, though. She wants to create a better life for them. So we see her dancing across the stage then, and she gets a bucket and a mop. And now she's going to Mrs. Lyons' house. Think about the open or thrust stage again. You see, it gives you plenty of room then to create Mrs. Lyons' house. And think about it, we do see the interior here because she has to go in. There has to be a contrast there from what we have learned already. And we have to see Mrs. Johnson engaging with Mrs. Lyons in her home. Mrs. Lyons has the upper hand here. We can see how manipulative she is when it comes to that key conversation about deciding to adopt one of the children, one of the boys. Okay, Mrs. Lyons arrives in then with a parcel. Now, what do we know about Mrs. Lyons? She's middle class. We also know that she is infertile as well. She can't have children of her own. Her husband is a businessman who has been away, of course, for a number of months already. So it's been 9 months in total. It's going to take him another 5 to come back. All of this is very important in terms of setting up the plot. Also the idea, of course, that Mrs. Lyons essentially is a lady of leisure. She doesn't have a job, but she has essentially a cleaner, and she doesn't actually do anything all day. Okay, so her life is unfulfilled. What does she need? What does she want most of all in the world? She wants a child. So what is she carrying? She's carrying shoes. That's going to be very important in telling us more about Mrs. Johnson as well. And even think of the fact they refer to each other as Mrs. Lyons, Mrs. Johnson. Society sees this as respectable as such. They're not friends though. They don't use each other's first names. We learn their first names later on, but they're always referred to as Mrs. Johnson and Mrs. Lyons then. Okay, so they just have this sort of polite, rather formal conversation. Notice the language here again, clearly indicating middle class. So she has this kind of standard English as such then, and her accent would not have a trace of Scouse in it whatsoever. Be quite a plummy accent. That's the word that we use when we're describing kind of like, it's almost like an upper middle class accent as such then. Okay, so she's just being very polite here. Hello, Mrs. Johnson, how are you? Is the job working out all right for you? And then Mrs. Johnson, yes, it's great, lovely house, and so on too. And then Mrs. Lyons, you can see how patronising she is, and she's completely unaware of the fact, of course, that Mrs. Johnson is envious of this and wants more for her. It's a pity it's so big. I'm finding it rather large at present. So she's kind of focusing on her own problems here, of course, the fact that she doesn't have children to fill this large house. And then we just get the plot details here, of course, setting it up very nicely for us. Oh, Mr. Lyons is away. When does he come back, Mrs. Lyons? Oh, the company sent him out there for 9 months and he'll be back in about 5 months. That's going to be perfect later on. Oh, you'd be glad when he comes back then. The house won't feel so empty. Actually, we bought such a large house for the children. We thought children would come along. Okay, and then we see the contrast essentially between Mrs. Lyons and Mrs. Johnson, where Mrs. Lyons then, of course, is sort of emphasizing the notion that Mr. Lyons, of course, wants a child, but he is not prepared to adopt a child. Now you can say that's kind of convenient because that leads us nicely then to the decision that Mrs. Johnson has to make. And then she says, commenting, it's weird though, isn't it? You can't have kids, and me, I can't stop having them. My husband used to say that all we had to do was shake hands and I'd be in the club. He must have shook hands with me before he left. I'm having another one, you know. Oh, it's all right though, Miss Lyons. Having babies is like clockwork to me. I'm back at my feet and working the next day, do you know? So think about working class women couldn't afford to take any time off even after having a child. So think about it. You kind of wonder, of course, about a kind of society that forces them to do that. No wonder she looks 20 years older than she actually is. So she says then, of course, rest assured, obviously, I won't even need a day off. I'll be back at work just the day after. So Mrs. Lyons then is taking out the new shoes out of the parcel that she's carried on stage. Miss Johnson then is appalled by Mrs. Lyons putting the shoes on the table. This is reinforcing then a particular characteristic of Mrs. Johnson. She says, Jesus Christ, Miss Lyons, what are you trying to do? Oh my God, what's wrong? The shoes. Pardon? New shoes on the table, take them off. And this is a common superstition that if you put shoes on the table, it'll bring you bad luck. And then she says, oh God, Mrs. Lyons, you never put new shoes on a table. You never know what will happen. And Mrs. Lyons says, oh, you mean you're superstitious? Mrs. Johnson, no, but you never put new shoes on the table, indicating that Mrs. Johnson doesn't understand the word superstitious. She's saying, no, I'm not superstitious. I would just never put shoes on a table. And yeah, you are superstitious. You just don't know what the word actually means here, indicating lack of education and class again. Oh, go on with you. So she puts them away then. Music is heard as Mrs. Johnson warily approaches the table and the narrator enters. So the narrator then commenting on the action here again. There's shoes upon the table and a joker in the pack. Joker in the pack is something unexpected. The salt's been spilled. Once more superstition, if you spill some salt, you have to throw some over your shoulder. And a looking glass cracked. If you break a mirror, 7 years bad luck. There's one lone magpie overhead. That relates back to the little verse, of course. 1 for sorrow, 2 for joy, 3 for a girl, 4 for a boy. So if you see one magpie, it's bad news, essentially. You have to see 2, almost like a little couple together. That would be positive. Mrs. Johnson, I'm not superstitious, the mother said. Of course she is, says the narrator. And then the narrator exits to re-enter as a gynecologist. There's going to be a little bit of humour here, but also relating back then to society and class difference and the mistreatment of women. So Mrs. Johnson says to him, what are you doing here? The milk bill's not due till Thursday, because it's the same actor playing narrator, milkman and gynecologist. So it's supposed to be kind of ironic and funny. So the gynecologist then producing a listening funnel, which would be like a stethoscope basically. Actually, I've given up the milk round and I've gone into medicine. Okay, mummy, let's have a little listen to the baby's ticker. Notice how patronising the doctor is here. Think about it, at that particular time, the 1950s, the vast majority of doctors would be male. And they would, of course, patronise their female patients in particular. She says, I was dead worried about having another baby, you know, doctor. I didn't see how we were going to manage with another mouth to feed. But now I've got me a little job, we'll be okay. We can just scrape by, even with another mouth to feed. So the gynecologist completes his examination and he says, mouths, mummy. Important plot detail then. What? Plural, Mrs. Johnson. Mouths to feed. You're expecting twins. So everything hinges on this. If you're having one child, it would be very difficult to actually focus on the plot twist then. Congratulations. And the next one, please, nurse. Very dismissive of her. Think about it. He doesn't engage with Mrs. Johnson on any kind of human or personal level here. There's no sense of offering her advice, checking that she's okay, and she is just shocked by this particular news. Okay, so the next day what I'll do is I will just have a look at the conversation between Mrs. Lyons and Mrs. Johnson, and we'll emphasize them as foils, and then I will focus on Mickey and Edward and how much, of course, they have in common, first of all, so similarities, comparisons, but then how we can also see them as foils as well. Okay, so when you're revising this, just have, as you're reading through, just kind of think about, we'd say, the stage directions, think about the characterization, think about the language, the music, the symbolism, and we'll formulate then different questions and we'll focus then on how to revise this the following week. Until then, guys, take care.